The room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly like lavender, the kind doctors use to make sterile places feel gentler than they are. Desmond Kane sat on the edge of the examination table, a paper gown crinkling under him, a glass of water trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand. He was 68 years old and had built half his fortune with those hands, and now they would not hold still. Dr. Whitfield did not look up from her notes right away. "Mr. Kane, have you noticed yourself forgetting things lately?" Desmond laughed, the kind of laugh a man uses to buy himself a second before answering. "Not at all," he started to say, and then he stopped, because the sentence did not feel true the moment it left his mouth. He tried to remember what he had eaten for breakfast. He could not. "Are you taking anything new?" the doctor asked. "Any new tea, any new medication, anything someone else might be preparing for you?" Desmond opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 6 weeks earlier. The kitchen at the Kane estate caught the morning light the way it always did, gold and slow across the marble counters, and Marisol Aguirre moved through it the way she moved through every morning of the 6 years she had worked there, without needing to think about where anything was. Coffee first, dark and strong the way Mr. Kane liked it, before he admitted he liked anything dark and strong, then the eggs, then the toast, set at an angle so the butter would not pool. Diesel lay under the breakfast table, chin flat on his paws, watching her with the patient devotion of a dog who understood that mornings belonged to her. He was 4 years old, broad through the chest, the color of wet sand, and he had arrived at the estate carrying a reputation he had never earned. The shelter had used the word difficult. Desmond, charmed by Marisol's insistence and a little bored with his own quiet house, had used the word fine. The staff, within a week, had started using the word killer, half as a joke, half as something they actually believed, because a dog that size, with a low steady growl in his chest, was easy to be afraid of if you did not know what the growl meant. Marisol knew, or she thought she did. "Smells like heaven in here," Colin Ashford said, stepping into the kitchen with the particular energy of a man who had already answered 40 emails before anyone else was awake. He was 36, dressed the way a man dresses when he wants to look like he did not spend time deciding what to wear, and he had a way of making every room feel slightly more organized the moment he entered it. 8 years he had worked for Desmond. 8 years of remembering birthdays, catching contract errors, sitting up late with spreadsheets so Desmond would not have to. He crossed toward the coffee pot, and as he passed the corner of the room where Diesel's water bowl sat, the dog went still. Not a growl, not yet, just a stillness, a held breath, the kind of tension that runs through an animal's body before it decides whether something is worth reacting to. Marisol noticed it because she noticed everything about that dog, the way you notice everything about the one creature in a house who never lies to you. She glanced at Colin. He was already smiling at her, already asking whether there were more of the cinnamon rolls from Sunday, already perfectly normal. She told herself she had imagined it. "Marisol," Desmond said, coming in still tying the belt of his robe, "have you seen my car keys?" "I could have sworn I left them on the hook by the garage door." "They're on the hook by the garage door, Mr. Kane," she said gently, the way she always answered him, without a trace of the small worry that had started, quietly, somewhere behind her ribs. "You put them there last night, did I?" He said it like a statement, not a question, the way people say things they are choosing to believe, rather than things they remember. "Of course I did." Colin laughed, easy and warm. "You're getting old, Desmond." "We're all getting old, Colin," Desmond said, and the room laughed with him, and the coffee was poured, and the eggs were served, and nothing about the morning suggested that anything in this house was wrong, except that under the table Diesel had not moved his eyes from the spot where Colin now stood, stirring sugar into his cup, whistling something low and pleasant under his breath, and Marisol found herself watching the dog instead of the man, without knowing why that felt like the safer thing to do. Evenings at the Kane estate had a rhythm Marisol could have performed with her eyes closed. Dinner cleared by 8, the study lamps switched on by past. And somewhere around 9, the tea tray, prepared and carried upstairs by Colin himself, because he had made it a point, years ago, that this one small ritual would always be his and no one else's. "Let the staff rest," he liked to say. "I don't mind looking after him at night." Desmond had called it thoughtful. Marisol had once thought so too. That evening she was folding linens in the hallway closet near the staircase when she heard it, the low, rolling growl that seemed to come up from somewhere beneath the floorboards rather than from an animal's throat. Diesel stood at the foot of the stairs, every muscle in his body locked, his eyes fixed on the tray in Colin's hands. Steam curled up from the teapot. Colin had stopped mid-step, one foot still raised, his expression arranging itself into patience with visible effort. "Diesel," Marisol said quietly, moving toward him, but the dog did not so much as flick an ear toward her voice. He had never done that before. Not once in 6 years had he ignored her. "Easy," Colin said, in the voice of a man who has decided to be amused rather than alarmed, though something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "It's just tea, boy." Diesel's growl deepened. Desmond appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the noise, still in his reading glasses, a folder of papers under one arm. "What in God's name is going on down there?" "Nothing to worry about," Colin said smoothly, though he had not moved another step. "Diesel seems to have decided he doesn't approve of my tea service tonight." A ripple of laughter went through the small audience that had gathered, one of the housemaids in the doorway, Mr. Harlan pausing on his way out to the garage. Marisol did not laugh. She was watching the dog's eyes, which had not once left the tray, and she was watching Colin's hands, which had gone very still around the handle. "Diesel." Desmond's voice cracked down the stairwell like a whip, the voice of a man used to being obeyed instantly by everyone in his life except, apparently, this one animal at this one moment. "Enough." The growl did not stop. If anything, it deepened, and Diesel took one stiff step forward, placing himself directly between the staircase and the tray, and for a half-second the whole hallway seemed to hold its breath. "He's never done this," Marisol said, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the sound of her own voice in the silence. "He's never done a lot of things," Colin said lightly, "until tonight." He smiled at Desmond, an easy, forgiving smile, the smile of a man refusing to take offense at a dog. "Honestly, it's fine. Dogs get jealous. He probably just doesn't like sharing you." Desmond came halfway down the stairs, his face somewhere between embarrassment and irritation, the particular irritation of a man who does not like being made to feel foolish in front of his staff. "Marisol, get him out of here. Put him outside if you have to. I won't have him behaving like this, not with Colin of all people." "Mr. Kane, I really don't think—" "Outside," Desmond said again, more sharply now, and something in his tone told her the conversation was already over. "Until he learns how to behave like a civilized animal in this house." Marisol crossed the hall and took hold of Diesel's collar. He did not resist her, not exactly, but he did not come easily either. His whole body angled backward toward the stairs even as she led him toward the kitchen door, his eyes never leaving the tray in Colin's hands until the two of them had disappeared around the corner. Behind her she heard Colin's footsteps resume up the stairs, unhurried, and Desmond's voice, softer now, apologizing to him for the scene, as though Colin were the one who had been wronged. "I'm so sorry about that," Desmond was saying. "I don't know what's gotten into him." "Don't worry about it," Colin said, and something in the warmth of his voice, heard from a distance, through a closing door, sounded thinner than it had a moment ago. "Some dogs just don't like anyone getting too close to the people they think belong to them." Outside, the night had turned cold enough that Marisol's breath showed in the porch light. She crouched down and cupped Diesel's face in both hands, and she pressed his head into her palms, the way he always did when he was frightened. But his eyes did not dart or blink. They stayed fixed and unmoving on the dark window above, the same way they had stayed fixed on the tray. "What did you see?" she whispered to him, not really expecting an answer, running her thumb along the ridge of his brow, the way that always calmed him. "What was in that cup, HM?" Diesel whined once, low in his throat, and turned his head back toward the house, toward the lit window of Desmond's study, 2 floors up, where the lamp had just gone dark for the night. She did not have an answer. She rose, brushed the gravel dust from her knees, and led him to the small dog bed under the heat lamp, tucking the blanket tight around his shoulders before she turned back toward the kitchen door alone. After that night, Diesel slept outside. It was framed, by everyone in the house, as a temporary measure, a few days until he calmed down, until whatever had spooked him passed. The few days became a week. The week became the new shape of things, the way new shapes always settle into a house without anyone deciding it out loud. A dog bed appeared on the covered part of the back porch. Someone hung a heat lamp for the coldest nights. No one called it permanent, and no one called it anything else either. Marisol began sneaking food out to him after the kitchen closed. Small things, a bit of chicken, the heel of a loaf of bread, nothing anyone would notice missing. She told herself it was kindness, and it was, but it was also the only part of her day that felt honest. Inside the house, she smiled and cleared plates and said, "Yes, Mr. Kane, of course, Mr. Kane." Outside, in the dark, with Diesel's warm weight leaning into her legs, she did not have to pretend anything. Her days had a rhythm she had never questioned before, but now, each evening, that rhythm brought her back to the same door, the same latch, the same square of cold air. She would finish the last of the dishes, hang the towel exactly where Mrs. Kane, years ago, had always liked it hung, and slip out through the mudroom with whatever small offering the kitchen could spare that night, careful to time it after Colin had already gone up for the evening, careful never to be seen doing it, though she could not have said, if pressed, exactly what she was afraid of being seen doing. He was different with her than he was with anyone else in the house, had always been different since the very first week he arrived. The other staff joked about it. "He just likes whoever feeds him," they said, the way people explain away anything they don't want to sit with too long. Marisol let them believe it because it was easier than trying to explain the truth, which was that Diesel trusted almost no one, and trusted her completely, and she had never been entirely sure why, until a particular cold evening on the back porch when the memory came to her whole and unbidden, the way memories do when your body finally has a moment quiet enough to hold them. Years before Diesel came to the Kane estate, back when Marisol still worked for a different family, there had been another dog, an old spaniel named Coco, who belonged to the household she cleaned for. Coco had always eaten everything put in front of her, gratefully, without hesitation, until one week she started refusing a particular dish, a beef stew the cook had started making with a new brand of seasoning. The family had laughed it off, said the dog was getting picky in her old age. Marisol had watched Coco sniff the bowl, back away, sniff it again, and refuse. She had thrown that batch of stew away herself, quietly, without telling anyone, some instinct in her insisting it was the right thing to do. It was months later, after a stomach illness had swept through half the household and the seasoning brand was recalled for contamination, that she understood what the dog had known before any of them. She had learned something that week, something she had carried with her ever since without ever having to say it out loud. An animal's nose does not lie to be polite, does not smooth things over to keep the peace, does not decide that some truths are inconvenient to notice. A dog either trusts what is in front of it or it does not, and it will tell you which, if you are willing to watch closely enough to see the difference between fear and warning. That was why, when Diesel arrived at the Kane estate wearing the word difficult like a collar he had not chosen, Marisol had simply crouched down to his level on his first morning and let him decide, in his own time, whether she was safe. He had pressed his head into her hand within the hour. Everyone else in the house he had kept at a careful, watchful distance for weeks, sidling around Colin's boots in the hallway, refusing treats offered by the gardener, growling once, quietly, at a delivery man who turned out later to have a police record none of them had known about at the time. She had never told anyone why she believed in him so completely from that very first day. It was not the kind of thing that translated well into a conversation over breakfast. Some nights, sitting out there with him, she thought about how strange it was that a house this large, this full of comfortable rooms and warm lamps, could still have exactly 2 creatures in it who were regularly sent out into the cold. She did not think of herself as unhappy. She had a roof, a wage, a room of her own with a window that caught the morning sun, but there was a particular loneliness in being useful without being heard, in being trusted with a house's most private hours and never once being asked what she thought about anything that happened inside it. And some nights that loneliness sat with her on the porch steps as plainly as the dog did. Mr. Harlan found her out there once, on his way to lock up the garage for the night, and instead of asking why she was sitting in the cold with the dog everyone else had decided to fear, he simply set down a second folding chair beside hers and sat without a word for a while, the 3 of them listening to the wind move through the hedges. "Man like Colin," he said eventually, apropos of nothing she had said aloud, "always so polished you forget to ask what's underneath it." She had not answered him that night, but she had thought about the comment for days afterward, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what has been living quietly beneath it. Tonight, on the cold porch, Diesel finished the last of the chicken and rested his head against her knee with a long sigh, the tension of the past days easing out of him for the first time since the incident on the stairs. She stroked the space between his ears, slow and steady, and felt something in her own chest loosen too. "Everyone thinks you just like being fed," she murmured to him, "but you don't do this with just anyone, you never have." He looked up at her, and there was nothing killer in his eyes at all, only the same steady devotion he had shown her from the very beginning, the devotion of a creature who had chosen once carefully, who was worth trusting, and had never once needed to reconsider. She thought about the tray of tea. She thought about the way his growl had not been the wild, indiscriminate aggression everyone in the house had described it as, but something narrow and specific, aimed at one man, one object, one moment. She thought about how a dog does not growl at a smell it has never questioned before, not without a reason. She did not have the reason yet. She stood, gathered the empty plate, and latched the porch door quietly behind her so it would not wake the house, pausing once at the kitchen window to watch him settle into the dog bed under the heat lamp before she went up to her own room. The pattern took shape slowly, the way patterns do when you are not looking for them on purpose, only noticing them because you happen to be paying attention for the first time in years. It was a Tuesday when Marisol first put 2 things together that had nothing, on the surface, to do with each other. Desmond had come down to breakfast asking, with real confusion in his voice, why nobody had reminded him that the Hendersons were coming for lunch that day, when in fact Marisol had watched him write the date into his own leather planner, not 4 days earlier, in his own careful hand. He had looked at the page when she showed it to him, at his own handwriting, and something had flickered across his face that she recognized, because she had seen it in her own mother once, in the last years before the nursing home. Not confusion exactly. Something closer to fear trying very hard to disguise itself as forgetfulness. "I must be losing my mind," he'd said, laughing it off the way he laughed off everything uncomfortable, and gone back to his eggs. She had not thought much of it until that evening, watching Colin carry the tea tray up the stairs as he did every night now, the ritual unbroken despite the incident weeks earlier, Diesel long since banished to the porch, and therefore no longer there to growl at anything. She realized, standing in the hallway with an armful of folded towels, that she could not remember a single morning in the past month when Desmond had forgotten something that had not been preceded, the night before, by that tray going up the stairs. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself this 3 separate times over the following week, and each time it grew a little harder to believe. A missed dinner reservation, the night after tea, a forgotten name at a golf club he'd belonged to for 15 years, the morning after tea. A signature on a check that Desmond, staring at it the next day, could not recall having written, though the ink was unmistakably his, the loops and slants of a hand that had signed 1,000 documents exactly the same way for 40 years, the morning after tea. Marisol began, without quite deciding to, keeping a private ledger in her head. She did not write anything down. Writing things down felt too much like accusation, and she had learned, a long time ago at a different job, in a different house, what happened to women who put their suspicions on paper before they had proof strong enough to survive being questioned. She had been 31 then, working as a bookkeeper's assistant for a small import company, and she had noticed discrepancies in the ledgers that did not add up, no matter how she turned the numbers. She had gone to her supervisor with what she'd found, certain, at the time, that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing. 3 weeks later, she had been let go for reasons the company called restructuring. 2 years after that, the owner had been indicted for exactly the fraud she had tried to report. She had been right. Being right had cost her a job she needed and taught her a lesson she had never quite unlearned. That speaking up, for a woman in her position, in houses that were never hers, rarely changed anything except her own employment status. So now she watched, and she remembered, and she said nothing, and she hated herself a little for the silence even as she chose it again and again. She began, too, to notice smaller things she had never bothered to track before. The way Desmond's hand shook slightly more in the mornings than it had a season ago. The way he sometimes stood in the doorway of a room he had entered 100 times, as though trying to remember why he had come in. The way he had started leaving small notes to himself on scraps of paper around the house, a habit she recognized, with a chill, from watching her own mother do the exact same thing in the year before the diagnosis, except her mother's notes had piled up slowly over years. Desmond's had appeared, all at once, over the span of a few short weeks, and something about that speed nagged at her in a way she could not yet put into words. Meanwhile, Colin's role in the house had grown the way water finds every low place in a floor. He no longer simply managed Desmond's calendar. He managed his correspondence. He managed his signatures on routine paperwork. Just to save you the trouble, you have enough on your plate. He had started sitting in on calls with Desmond's accountant, then taking those calls alone, then summarizing them for Desmond afterward, in terms Desmond had stopped questioning. He had begun, too, gently steering conversations at the dinner table, correcting Desmond's small misremembered facts in front of guests with such warm, patient good humor that no one in the room ever thought to question who benefited from Desmond looking, again and again, a little less sure of himself. One afternoon, Marisol came upon Colin in the study, sliding a small locked box into the bottom drawer of Desmond's own desk, a drawer she had dusted around for 6 years without once seeing anything kept inside it under lock. He looked up when she entered, unhurried, unbothered, already smiling before she had said a word. "Just some paperwork. Mr. Kane doesn't need cluttering his desk," he said, turning the key and slipping it into his own pocket rather than leaving it, as had always been the custom in that house, on the ring by the door. She said nothing, only nodded and set down the stack of ironed shirts she had come to deliver. But she noted, the way she noted everything now, that the drawer had never once been locked before Colin started managing Desmond's affairs, and that whatever was inside it, it was not something Colin wanted found by accident. "You don't need to worry about any of this," Colin told Desmond one evening, in the study, with the door half open so that Marisol, dusting the hall table outside, could hear every word. "That's what I'm here for. Let me carry some of the weight." "I don't know what I'd do without you," Desmond said, and there was real gratitude in his voice, the gratitude of a man who genuinely believed he was being spared a burden rather than relieved of a choice. Marisol stood very still outside that door, a dust cloth forgotten in her hand, and thought about the growl at the foot of the stairs, and the tea going up night after night, and the checkbook Desmond could no longer quite explain, and Diesel curled up alone on the cold porch for a crime that had never actually been committed. She did not have proof of anything. She had a feeling, and a memory of what feelings had cost her before, and a house that was very good. She was beginning to understand, at making sure the people who noticed things had no one who would believe them. There was a particular exhaustion in carrying a suspicion no one else could see. She went through her days doing the same work she had always done, smoothing sheets, polishing silver, answering the phone in the same even voice, and underneath all of it ran a second, private accounting she had never asked to keep, tallying every small forgetting, every quiet erosion, the way another woman might tally grocery receipts. She wondered, some nights, whether she was imagining the whole shape of it, whether grief and loneliness had simply made her suspicious of a good man doing his job too well. But then she would remember the growl at the foot of the stairs, the one sound in that entire house that had never once been wrong about anything, and the doubt would recede again, at least until morning. Even so, the doubt always returned by the following evening, right on schedule, the same way the tea tray always returned to the top of the stairs, and she had begun to understand that the two things were never going to stop arriving together. That night, carrying an extra blanket out to the porch for Diesel, she found him already awake, watching the lit window of the study 2 floors above, with the same fixed attention he'd shown the tea tray weeks before, as though he too were keeping count of something the rest of the house had stopped bothering to notice. "I see it too," she told him quietly, tucking the blanket around him. "I just don't know yet what I'm supposed to do about it." The papers arrived on a Thursday, in a leather folder Colin set on the study desk with the practiced care of a man arranging something he did not want examined too closely. "It's just a power of attorney for asset management," he explained, standing at Desmond's shoulder rather than sitting across from him, close enough that his voice stayed low and steady, close enough that his hand rested briefly on the back of Desmond's chair, like a reassurance. "Nothing changes day to day. It just means I can handle the accounts, the investments, the paperwork, without needing your signature on every little thing. Given everything you've had on your mind lately, I thought it might take some pressure off." Desmond turned the pages slowly. His reading glasses had slid down his nose, and behind them his eyes moved over the dense legal language, the way a man's eyes move over a language he does not quite speak, searching for a word he recognizes to hold on to. "This is rather a lot of authority, isn't it, Colin? It's standard for someone in my position, at your age, given how things have been." Colin said it gently, but there was a small, careful weight on the words "at your age" that Desmond did not seem to catch, though Marisol, arranging flowers in the hallway just outside the open door, caught it entirely. "I only want to make things easier for you. You've been forgetting things, Desmond. We both know it. I'd rather you didn't have to worry about the accounts on top of everything else." Desmond was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Marisol could see him doing the thing she had watched him do more and more over the past weeks, searching his own memory for solid ground and finding none, and mistaking that emptiness for proof that he needed exactly the kind of help being offered to him. He looked for a moment very small behind that wide desk, a man who had once negotiated deals worth more than most people's entire lives, now unable to trust his own recollection of what he had eaten for breakfast. Marisol thought, watching him from the hallway, of the man who had hired her 6 years ago, brisk and certain, striding through the house with a decisiveness that had once made her a little nervous to be around. That man seemed, in this moment, to be sitting several rooms away from the one holding the pen. "You're right," he said finally, and picked up the pen. "You know me better than I know myself these days, it seems." "I've always got your back," Colin said, and watched him sign. Marisol had not meant to say anything. She had told herself, walking past that door with an armful of lilies, that this was not her business, that she had learned this lesson already, that speaking up cost her things she could not afford to lose. She had rehearsed, in the privacy of her own head, 100 versions of staying quiet, of simply finishing her rounds and going to bed, and letting the house sort out its own affairs the way it always eventually did, one way or another, with or without her opinion. But something about the sight of that pen moving across the page, something about the particular defeated slope of Desmond's shoulders as he signed, broke through 6 years of careful silence before she could stop it. "Mr. Kane," she said, stepping into the doorway, "I don't mean to overstep, but Diesel has been out on that porch for weeks now over one bad evening, and I can't help but notice that things have been—" "Marisol." Colin's voice cut across hers, pleasant on the surface and hard underneath, like a floor with rot beneath the polish. "This really isn't the time. I only meant—" "What you meant," Colin said, straightening to his full height, still smiling, still perfectly composed, "is that you'd like to weigh in on a family matter that has nothing to do with you. I understand you're fond of the dog. But Mr. Kane's finances and Mr. Kane's household decisions aren't really within the scope of your position here, are they?" The word position landed exactly where he meant it to land. "I've worked for this family 6 years, Marisol said, and hated the slight tremor she heard in her own voice, hated that after everything she still could not make herself sound as certain as she felt. "And you've done wonderful work," Colin said smoothly, "which is precisely why I'd hate for anything to jeopardize it. Overstepping into matters like this, matters you don't fully understand, well, it wouldn't reflect well on your judgment, would it? I'd hate to have to mention it to Mr. Kane if it became a pattern." It was not shouted. It was not even unkind, on its surface, delivered in the same warm tone he used for everything, which somehow made it worse, made it feel less like a threat than like a simple statement of fact, the way a locked door is a simple statement of fact. Desmond, still gazing at the signed pages in front of him, did not seem to register any of it as a threat at all. He looked up at Marisol with something almost apologetic. "Colin's only trying to help, Marisol. I know you mean well about the dog, but I really don't have the energy for this today." She looked at him, really looked, the way she had not let herself look in weeks, and saw a man who had signed away authority over his own life without fully understanding that he had done so, sitting in a room with the one person who had engineered every piece of his confusion, defending that person against the only other person in the house who had noticed anything was wrong. There was nothing left to say to that. She understood, standing there, that no argument she could make in this moment would land anywhere but against the wall Colin had spent months building around Desmond's trust, brick by patient brick, one small favor and one small forgetting at a time. "Of course, Mr. Kane," she said quietly. "I'm sorry to have interrupted." She left the room with the lilies still in her arms, walked the length of the hallway, and stood for a moment at the top of the back stairs, with her hand pressed flat against the cool plaster wall, willing her breathing to slow. Somewhere below, faintly, she could hear Diesel's low whine drifting up from the porch, as though he too had felt the shift in the house without needing to hear a single word of what had been said. She stood there long enough that the lilies began to wilt slightly in her arms, long enough to replay in her mind every version of the conversation that might have gone differently, though she knew, even as she replayed them, that none of them would have. Colin had built this house's trust in him too carefully, over too many years, for one maid's warning to unbuild it in a single afternoon. She thought of her mother's voice, years ago, telling her that some doors only opened from the inside, and that all you could do while you waited was keep your own hands ready. That evening, alone in her small room off the servants' hall, she sat by the window a long while before turning in, watching the last light drain from the sky over the grounds. She thought about handing in her notice the next morning, about how much simpler her life would be in some other house, some smaller house, where nothing was ever asked of her except the work her hands already knew how to do. She thought about it seriously, turning the idea over the way she turned over every hard decision, and found, in the end, that she could not make herself want it. Somewhere below her window, Diesel would already be curled on his cold porch bed, waiting for a woman who was, whatever else she might be in that house, the one thing he trusted completely, and she was not, she realized, prepared to leave him there alone to face whatever came next. For the first time since the bookkeeping job, since the firing that had taught her silence was safer, she found herself thinking a single clear thought, cold and quiet beneath the fear. This was not her fault for speaking. It had never been her fault. It had simply never mattered, in rooms built the way this one was, whether she was right. She did not know yet what she would do about that. Downstairs, faintly, she heard Diesel shift against the porch boards, a small restless sound in the dark, and she set the wilted lilies on the sill, went down the back stairs in her stocking feet, and sat beside him on the cold planks until the porch light clicked off on its timer. Mr. Harlan had driven for the Kane family for 22 years, long enough to have taught a young, impatient Desmond Kane to parallel park a car he'd bought before he'd earned the money to buy it, long enough to remember the late Mrs. Kane's laugh better than most people remembered her face. He kept mostly to the garage these days, a converted stone building at the edge of the property that smelled of engine oil and old leather seats, and he did not involve himself in the affairs of the main house because in 22 years he had learned exactly where the line was between his job and everyone else's business. Marisol found him there on a Wednesday evening, polishing a headlight that did not need polishing, the particular occupation of a man who needs his hands busy while his mind works something over. "You've been quiet lately," he said, without looking up. "Quieter than usual, and you're not usually a loud woman to begin with." She stood in the doorway for a moment, weighing, one last time, whether to say what she had come to say. Then she thought of the growl at the foot of the stairs, and the pen moving across the page, and the word position landing like a closed door, and she stepped inside. "Mr. Harlan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not repeat it to anyone in that house." He set down the cloth. Something in her tone had reached him. "Go on. You were there that night on the stairs," she started. "You saw Diesel go after the tea tray with your own eyes." He nodded slowly, remembering it plainly, and she saw they were not starting from nothing but comparing what each of them had already seen. She went on, filling in the rest, carefully, in order, the way she had been silently cataloging it in her own head for weeks. The tea tray, unbroken every night since, the mornings after, the missing name, the missing date, the check Desmond couldn't recall signing. The power of attorney, signed that same afternoon, and the threat wrapped in silk that had followed her question about it. Mr. Harlan listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing until she finished, and then he was quiet for a long moment, looking out the garage window toward the dark shape of the main house. "I've known Desmond Kane since he was 34 years old," he said finally. "Sharp as a tack back then, could recite a contract back to you line for line a week after reading it once. This isn't him getting old, Marisol, not like this, not this fast." "That's what I thought," she said, something in her chest loosening slightly at having it confirmed by someone else, someone who had known Desmond long enough to have real ground to stand on. "But I don't have proof of anything. I have a feeling and a dog who won't go near a teapot." Mr. Harlan was quiet again, and then he crossed to an old metal cabinet in the corner of the garage and pulled out a small paper calendar, the kind that hung on a nail, mostly used to track oil changes and tire rotations. He set it on the workbench between them and picked up a pencil. "Then let's find out if there's a pattern," he said. "You tell me every night Collins carried that tray up. I'll tell you every morning I've driven Desmond somewhere and he's asked me something twice, or forgotten where we were going halfway there. We put the two lists side by side. If it's nothing, it's nothing. If it's something, we'll see it." They worked for the better part of an hour, Marisol recalling dates from memory with the precision of someone who had, without realizing it, been keeping this record all along, simply by living inside it. Mr. Harlan added his own observations, quieter things she hadn't been in a position to see: Desmond forgetting the route to his own accountant's office, twice, a route he had driven monthly for a decade. Desmond calling him by his late father's name once, in the car, and correcting himself a moment later with visible alarm. When they laid the two lists beside each other on the workbench, under the single bare bulb, the pattern did not need explaining. Every date that Mr. Harlan had marked for confusion or forgetting sat directly beside, or one day after, a date Marisol had marked for tea. "There it is," Mr. Harlan said quietly, and for the first time since she'd walked into the garage, Marisol saw something other than calm on his weathered face. "There it is. What do we do with it?" she asked. "We don't have anything a lawyer would call evidence. We have a coincidence written on the back of an oil change calendar." Mr. Harlan was quiet, turning the pencil over in his fingers. "You said Colin got upset when you asked about the dog." "Very upset," underneath the smile. "Man like that doesn't get upset over nothing," he said. "In 22 years I've never once seen him lose his composure. Not for a missed flight, not for a bad deal, not for anything. He got upset over a maid asking about a dog on a porch." He shook his head slowly. "That tells you something all by itself, doesn't it?" Marisol looked at the calendar again, at the small pencil marks lining up like footprints leading somewhere she still could not fully see the end of. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Mr. Harlan, has Colin ever talked to you about where he worked before this house?" Mr. Harlan's expression shifted, something old surfacing behind his eyes. "Once, years ago, when he'd had a bit too much wine at the Christmas party, of all things. Told me about a family he'd worked for before Desmond, up in Connecticut, some old money name I don't remember anymore. Said he'd given them 15 years, and they'd let him go inside a month. No warning, no explanation, once the old man in that family got too frail to manage his own affairs, and the children took over." Colin said it like it still burned him. Said he'd sworn he'd never let something like that happen to him again. The two of them stood in the quiet garage for a long moment, the bare bulb humming faintly overhead, the pencil marks between them saying more than either of them wanted to say out loud. "So what do we actually do?" Marisol asked finally. "Go to Mr. Kane with a calendar and a theory? He'll believe Colin over both of us combined. He's signed papers already. We need something he can't argue away. Then we wait, and we watch closer than we've been watching," Mr. Harlan said. "You're inside that house every day in a way I'm not anymore. If there's proof to find, it's going to be something small, something he thinks nobody's paying attention to. A bottle, a receipt, something he keeps close because he thinks nobody would ever think to look." He tapped the calendar once with the pencil, thoughtful. "Keep your eyes open. Don't push him again the way you did today. Let him think he's already won." "I don't like where that leads," Marisol said finally. "Neither do I," Mr. Harlan said. "But I think you already knew where it led before you walked in here tonight." She had. She just hadn't let herself say it, not even to the dog on the porch, not even to herself in the dark. Now it sat between them on the workbench, plain and unavoidable as pencil marks under a single bulb, and there was no folding it back up small enough to ignore again. Colin had noticed her watching. It was a small thing, the kind of thing only a man as observant as he was would catch. The extra half-second Marisol lingered near a doorway, the way her eyes tracked the tea tray now instead of sliding past it, the fact that she and the old driver had taken to standing together near the garage at odd hours, heads bent close, voices low. He said nothing about it directly. He simply began to move faster. There was, in the days that followed, a subtle new sharpness to him that only Marisol seemed to notice, a slight fraying at the edges of his usual composure, a beat too long before he answered a question, a smile that arrived half a second late. He had spent 8 years perfecting the art of being indispensable, of anticipating exactly what a house needed before it knew it needed it, and now, for the first time, something in that house had started anticipating him back, and he did not care for the reversal at all. She noticed, too, that the locked drawer in the study had begun to fill. Twice that week she had seen him carry small stacks of paper up from his car in a leather satchel he had never used before, and twice she had seen the study door close firmly behind him while he was inside, longer than any routine correspondence should have taken. Whatever he was building toward, he was building it quickly now, and quickly, she had learned in 6 years of watching this house breathe, was rarely a sign of a man who felt he had time to spare. He raised the subject of Diesel at dinner 2 nights later, gently, almost sorrowfully, as though it pained him deeply to bring it up at all. "I've been thinking about the dog," he said, cutting his food with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. "I know you're fond of him, Desmond, but honestly, with everything going on, with the sensitivity around the estate right now, I do wonder if it's wise to keep an animal in the house with that kind of history, especially one who's already growled at a guest once. If something happened, if he ever actually bit someone, given your position, the liability alone could be significant." Desmond, who had grown visibly more tired in the past weeks, who now moved through his own house with the careful uncertainty of a man walking through a room in the dark he used to know by heart, rubbed at his temple. "You think he's dangerous?" "I think," Colin said carefully, "that a dog with that kind of bite history and that kind of unpredictable behavior probably needs more structured help than we can give him here. There's a facility upstate, very reputable, specializes in rehabilitating dogs exactly like him. I could have someone come collect him tonight, honestly, get it handled before it becomes something you have to think about at all." "Tonight?" Desmond repeated faintly. "No sense drawing it out," Colin said gently. "You've got enough on your mind." Marisol was clearing plates near the sideboard, and her hands went very still around the stack of china. She looked at Desmond, willing him to hesitate, to ask a single question, to remember that Diesel had never once, in 6 years, hurt anyone, that the growling had happened exactly once and only ever toward one man in one specific moment. She opened her mouth, half a second from speaking, and caught herself, remembering the word position, remembering exactly how quickly that word could be turned against her again. But Desmond only nodded slowly, the nod of a man too tired to argue, too uncertain of his own judgment lately to trust it against Colin's. "If you think it's best," he said. "I always think of what's best for you," Colin said, and reached for his wine. It happened faster than Marisol could process. A car was called. A handler arrived within the hour, a stranger in a company polo shirt, with a leash and a crate in the back of a van, polite and businesslike, treating Diesel the way you might treat any piece of property being relocated. Marisol stood on the porch steps in the cold evening air, her whole body cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, and watched them lead him across the gravel toward the van. Diesel did not fight the leash. He was too well trained, too gentle at heart, despite everything the house had decided to believe about him. But halfway across the drive he stopped, planted his feet, and turned his head back toward the house, not toward Marisol this time, but past her, up toward the lit window of Desmond's study, where a shadow moved briefly behind the curtain. He held that look for 3 full seconds, his ears back, his whole body straining toward the house, as though there were something he still needed to say, some warning he had not finished delivering. Then the handler tugged the leash gently, and he turned, and let himself be led the rest of the way, because that was who he was, gentle to the end even when the world had decided otherwise about him. The van doors closed, the engine started. Marisol stood on the steps with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the taillights swing out through the gates and disappear down the long dark drive, and the careful composure she had been holding for weeks finally cracked, her hands shaking against her own arms. she thought, standing there in the cold, of every quiet promise she had made to him on that porch over the past weeks, every unspoken agreement between them that she would keep watching, keep gathering what pieces she could, until enough of them fit together to matter. And now the one creature in the house, who had never once been wrong, was being driven away into the dark, and she had let it happen, standing right there on the steps, with her arms full of nothing. She thought, too, of Mr. Harlan's calendar, folded in a drawer in the garage, and of every night she had told herself there would be time to gather more proof before anything irreversible happened. There had not been time after all. The house had simply moved faster than her caution, the way it always moved faster than the people in it who had the least power to slow it down. She turned and went back into the house, not toward the kitchen, not toward her own small room off the servants' hall, but straight down the front hallway toward the study, where Desmond sat alone at his desk in the lamplight, staring at nothing in particular, a man who had just given away a piece of his own family, without quite understanding that he had done it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and he looked up at her with tired, apologetic eyes. And for the first time in 6 years she did not wait to be asked before she spoke. "Mr. Kane," she said, "I need you to listen to me, just this once, just for 5 minutes." He blinked at her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, and something about the look on her face, something he had perhaps never let himself see clearly before, made him set down his pen. "All right, Marisol," he said slowly, "I'm listening." She took a breath, and felt, for the first time in weeks, the strange relief of a door finally opening rather than closing. She thought of the growl on the stairs, the tray going up every single night, the calendar in the garage with its 2 columns of pencil marks lining up like footprints, the word position, the dog now shut in a crate somewhere on a dark highway for a crime he had never committed. She had 6 years of silence behind that single sentence, and she meant, this time, to use every last one of them, no matter what it cost her this time, no matter what word he tried to put in her way. But before she could say another word, before the sentence she had been rehearsing in her head for weeks could make it past her lips, she heard faintly, through the study's half-open window, the distant sound of the delivery van's engine, not fading down the drive as it should have been by now, but idling, stopped, somewhere just beyond the gates, as though something out there had made it pause. Marisol did not wait to explain herself. She was out the front door and across the gravel drive before Desmond had even risen from his chair, her slippers slapping cold stone, her breath fogging white in the porch light. At the gate, the van sat idling, its taillights washing red across the hedges, the handler leaning against the driver's door on his phone, having stopped, she would learn later, only because a delivery truck further down the lane had blocked the private road for a few minutes. "Wait," she called, breathless, one hand raised. "Please, wait, just 5 minutes. I need him to eat something before he goes. He hasn't touched his dinner. He'll be sick on the drive." The handler, unbothered, shrugged and gestured toward the back of the van. It was such a small, ordinary excuse, but Marisol had learned enough in 6 years about the space between what people say and what people mean to know it would work. 10 minutes, he said, not a minute more. She led Diesel back across the gravel on his leash, his whole body loose with relief at the reprieve, and instead of taking him toward the kitchen, she took him upstairs, toward the small changing room off the hallway where she had watched Colin hang his coat not an hour before. She did not fully understand what she was looking for. She only knew, with the clear, cold certainty of a woman who has finally stopped doubting her own eyes, that she was not leaving that room empty-handed. The coat hung exactly where she expected, and her hands, shaking only slightly, went through the inner pocket first, because that was where a careful man would keep something he did not want found in an outer one. Her fingers closed around a small brown bottle, unlabeled except for a strip of paper taped crookedly across the front, the seal already broken, half its contents gone. Colin had been carrying Desmond's tea tray up to the study when he noticed the changing room door standing open and stopped to check it, setting the tray down on the side table just inside the doorway. She had barely lifted the bottle into the light when the door opened behind her. "What?" Colin said very quietly. "Do you think you're doing?" There was no warmth left in his voice at all now, none of the practiced ease she had heard for 6 years. He crossed the room in 3 strides and reached for the bottle, and she pulled it back instinctively, and in the small space between them something shifted, fast and physical, his hand closing hard around her wrist. "Give it to me," he said, low, urgent, all pretense gone from his face. "Marisol, I am telling you, give it to me now." Diesel moved before she did. He came off his leash in a single motion, a low sound tearing out of his chest that was nothing like the growl on the staircase weeks before, something sharper, more decided, and he put his body between Colin and Marisol with the full weight of his shoulder, forcing Colin back a step. Colin, startled, let go of her wrist to catch his balance against the doorframe, and in the same motion knocked the tea tray from the side table, the porcelain shattering across the hardwood, hot liquid spreading in a dark stain toward the rug. "Get him off me," Colin said, backing further, reaching for the fallen tray as though he meant to hurl the remains of it. And Diesel lunged, not for his throat, only for the sleeve of his jacket, teeth closing over fabric and the soft press of forearm beneath it, just enough to make Colin cry out and stumble back against the wall, the bottle rolling from Marisol's open hand and coming to rest against the doorframe. "Diesel, enough," Marisol said, and he released instantly, stepping back to stand rigid at her side, chest heaving, eyes never leaving Colin. The noise had carried down the hallway. Desmond appeared in the doorway seconds later, his face draining of color as he took in the scene, the shattered tray, the spreading stain, Colin pressed against the wall clutching his forearm, Marisol standing with the small brown bottle held out, trembling, in her open palm. "What," Desmond said, very quietly, "is this?" Nobody answered right away. Marisol watched something move behind Desmond's eyes as he looked at the bottle, then at Colin, then, slowly, at the pattern of the last several weeks laid out finally in a shape he could see all at once, the missing names, the missing dates, the check he could not recall signing, the tea going up every night without fail. "I signed those papers 3 weeks ago," he said slowly, as though reciting something he had just remembered whole. "I told myself I must have forgotten discussing it." He looked up at Colin, his voice losing every trace of the confusion that had lived in it for weeks. "I didn't forget, did I?" Colin did not answer. He had gone very still, the practiced warmth gone entirely from his face, a man watching 8 years of careful architecture collapse in a single held breath. "I asked you a question," Desmond said. "You were becoming a liability to yourself," Colin said finally. No apology in it, only cold, exhausted honesty. "I gave everything to the last family I worked for and they threw me out the moment the old man got too weak to sign his own name. I wasn't going to let that happen twice." "By poisoning me," Desmond said, and his voice, for the first time, shook, not with confusion, but with grief. "A mild sedative," Colin said. "Nothing dangerous, just enough to keep you pliable." Desmond looked, for a long moment, at the man he had trusted more than anyone else alive, and then at Marisol, standing quiet and steady by the door with a growling dog at her side, and a small bottle of proof still held out in her open hand, the woman he had told, not 30 minutes earlier, that he did not have the energy to listen to. "Marisol," he said, his voice cracking on her name, "I am so sorry." She did not say anything right away. She only nodded once and let her hand drop to rest on Diesel's broad head, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, something in that house finally settle into a shape that made sense. Desmond had called the police himself the moment Colin admitted what was in the bottle, his voice steadier on the phone than it had been in weeks. Colin left the estate that same night, escorted to a waiting car by two officers who had arrived quietly, at Desmond's own request. From the study window, Marisol watched the taillights fade down the long drive, the same drive Diesel had once been led down in a stranger's van, and this time nobody stood there dreading what the taillights meant. The days after were quiet in a way the house had not been quiet in months. Desmond spent an evening with a lawyer, reading back through every page he had signed, his own handwriting steady again now that nothing was being slipped into his tea to blur it. When he finished, he called for Marisol, and instead of instructions, he simply asked her, for the first time in 6 years, "Marisol, what do you think I should do?" She sat with him a long while, and told him plainly, the way she had wanted to for weeks. On a warm afternoon not long after, the three of them sat together on the back steps, in the slanting gold light, Diesel stretched at their feet in a patch of sun, utterly at ease. Nobody in that house called him killer anymore. Desmond rested his hand on the dog's broad head, the same gesture Marisol had made 100 times in the dark. "He knew," Desmond said quietly. "All along he knew." "He always does," she said. The sun kept sinking warm over the garden, and for the first time in a long while, nobody in that house was waiting for anything to go wrong.